Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, whatever it is where you are. My name is Ari Nordström, and I'm part of the Markup UK organisation committee. As you know, there was no physical conference this year for obvious reasons, and so we did these webinars instead. And in case you haven't, in case you weren't able to attend some of them, they are all available on our YouTube channel. There's also a link from our webpage, the schedule page. And as the past ones then, this one will be recorded too, and it will be made available later today. Today, as many times before this June, our topic is XProc, surprise, surprise. It's an XProc Q&A session with Achim Berndzen and Erik Siegel, both of whom are editors of the XProc spec. And they will be answering your questions, actually, questions put to them by past attendees. And you will also get a chance to ask your questions in the Q&A box during the session. So after the Q&A, there will be a Q&A, hopefully. Glad I made that clear. As for me, I would like to thank you from all of us at Markup UK for supporting us, from me, from Andrew Sales, from Geert Bormans and Rebecca Schub. Thank you so much for supporting us. And obviously a huge thanks to Achim and Erik and David Maus, Liam Quinn and Anne Retta, all of whom did great presentations. You should check them out if you haven't already. And obviously, we'd like to thank you all, and we really hope to see you next year in a physical Markup UK conference in late May, early June, hopefully. Over to you, Achim and Erik, take it away.
All right, I will do the first question, and I'll try to share my screen. There it is. I hope, no, share. Right. What I want to do is answer a question from Philip Lowles. I hope I pronounce it right. And he asks me, I have a directory with zip files, and in each zip file is an XML file, and I want to change all the zip files. I want to change all the XML files into zip files in some way and output a new directory with zip files. At least that's how I understood it. So, and he couldn't put it together in XProc 3. So I'm going to show you one of the ways you could do this. To do this, if you look at the code here, I set up a simple XProc pipeline with two options. No, it has no input port, but it has two options: the input directory and the output directory. They're called input and build, and since they're relative, they will be taken relative against the location of the pipeline itself, but you can change that behavior if you want to. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to ask for the directory list of the input directory, and there is a P directory. Can you make the type size a bit bigger, even more bigger? All right. The first thing we're going to do is to ask for a directory list of the input directory. We're not going into subdirectories, and we are only interested in zip files. So that's what we're going to do. Now, what happens if we run this? If you do that, you get a C directory element as output, and within that, all the files that are in the directory that follow the include filter you mentioned. So in this case, I have example1.zip and example2.zip. And for this example, I've set them up both with an XML file inside, which is totally uninteresting, but it just serves as an example. So then what you can do is you can loop over all the file entries in the in what comes out of directory. So you say for each, and you say with input, and please select for me all the C file elements in there. Now then I'll what I do is I take the zip file name, which is the name attribute of the C file. I create a full name, which is the input directory followed by this file name. And then the first thing I need to do is to unarchive these the XML files in the zip file. And what you can do, you can say p unarchive include all the XML files, all files ending at XML. And this might be a neat a tip. You can add message attributes to all your steps, which will say something on standard output, what you put here. So in this case, I say, I'm now going to unarchive this file name. And in the unarchive tab, of course, I put in an href to the zip I want to unarchive. Then I do some change. I just add an attribute, which is of course not interesting, but in the Philip Laus asked me, can I run an XSLT? Yes, of course you can run an XSLT. The output of this unarchive tab will be an XML file, and you can run an XSLT over this. And then you have to create a new zip file. For this, XProc has an parchive step. And what you do in the parchive step, usually to the parchive step, as I showed you in the zip webinar I gave a few weeks ago, you pass in a manifest. But the parchive step in this case has a neat feature. So you don't need actually an archive file. What you say, I want, please, what comes in here are all the files from which are in the original archive. Please store them in a new archive, and to find out where to store them in a new archive, take the base URI, what comes out of the unarchive, which is the zip file name followed by the file name in the archive. But please take the file name relative to the file name of the original archive, which I used here. So what happens actually here is that the parchive uses now the same names inside the archive, inside the new archive, as they were in the old archive, in the original archive. So it actually reconstructs the old archive, but now using the same names. Then what comes out here is a zip file, a binary file. So I want to store it, and I create a variable with the output file name. You don't have to do that, you can do that directly, but because I want to write a message here as well, I created the variable with the output file name, and I use it to store the output, the zip file, and to write it to, and I also use it to produce a message, so I can see where it is writing to. Now, then I need some kind of report of all this process. So the pstore has its secondary output port called result URI, which tells you where it stores something, and I'll take the output of that port as the result of the for each. So this thing runs twice because we have two zip files. So what comes out are two C result elements with the URI of where it stored the zip. And then to make the whole result well formed, I wrap this sequence into a zips written element, or it could be any element you want to have. So let's see what happens when we run this. Okay, seems to work. As you can see, it says I'm unarchiving input example1.zip, and then I'm writing to build example1.zip, unarchiving the second zip file, writing to the second zip file. And as a result, it has the zips written root element with inside two C result elements of actually where it wrote the thing. Now, did it work? If I go into Oxygen and I look in the build directory, I see an example1.zip file. And if I look at that file, I'll see a timestamp added, which is the timestamp of the time I run the pipeline. So this pipeline actually worked. So it's actually quite easy to do these kinds of things. You ask for the contents of a directory, you loop over the contents of the directory, and you do your thing. That's it. Over to you, Achim, or do we do a Q&A now?
Let's go over to Achim directly. Thanks.
Okay, hi everyone. Let me just make this bigger for you. The question I have to deal with is about the extension attribute or the common attribute use when. Are there techniques to make a step optional in a pdeclare, or maybe an output or an input port optional, some kind of step overloading, all based on use when? The short answer is yes. The longer one comes now. Let me give you a bit of background. Use when is an attribute which you can use on any element, or yes, on any element in an XProc pipeline, and it behaves, I think, this actually the same as it does in XSLT. So it virtually, no, it physically excluded the element it's on. Just show you how this works. Let's look for a normal pipeline. I have a small pipeline which does not do any fancy stuff. I create a document, then I add an attribute to this document. I insert a child on this document, and then I want to have a UUID on this child element. I think this is pretty clear. What I have between all these steps is I have a pstore step. So every time a step ran, this step ran, I can see the results in this document, and I can see the results in this document, and I can see the results in this document. So this is the ultimate type of debugging for this one. pstore behaves like a p identity, so the input is the output with the side effect of storing the input. So this is pretty nice. However, if you go to production, you do not want to have all this pstore in, so you could comment it out or delete it out. A better way is actually, and this is where use when comes in, to use the attribute use when. If you look here at this pstore, I added now an attribute use when. It takes an XParsed expression. If the XParsed expression evaluates to effective true, then this element is in the pipeline. If it evaluates to effective Boolean false, it's out of the pipeline. And this is in, to be out of the pipeline is in the physical sense. The spec says if use when evaluates to false, the processor has to behave as if the step were never written. So it's actually an exclusion which is done before the pipeline is, at least in my processor, before the pipeline actually compiles. And this is a good debugging tool, because if use when is false, this pstore will never happen. It will never contribute to the graph. It cannot get you into trouble. And this is the easy way to do this. So I have here this debug use when, and the debug use $debug goes to an option, and this option has to be a static option, because you have to remember that all of this is actually done before the processor compiles the pipeline. So it cannot be a normal option, which is used during pipeline evaluation. It has to be an option which is visible during static analysis of the pipeline. And this is done by, by setting static true. And we now can run this pipeline with static true. If I run this, you see the result comes out as expected. And we now have, where is this here? We have in the temp folder, we have the three results of the stores. If I now delete the temp folder, come on. Yes, I'm sure. And set static to false and run it again. I got a problem. Ah, sorry. I can't. This static has to be this one. So you have also seen what happens if you don't declare it static. You get a lot of error messages. I have to change this one, save it and run it. And now the result is the same. But if we look into the folder, no new files were written. So this is a handy way to switch things on and off for debugging. And you can imagine this doing on the top level of your pipeline, and you have a lot of debugging informations, and you can turn them on and off as you like. You might even think of having different debugging levels defined and switch them on and off. So this is one thing you can do with use when. The other thing is what you could do is you could use it to make your pipelines language aware. I have another option now with the name language, and it's set to DE. So if I run this, I now actually exclude this element, which says hello world, when the language is English, and I include only this element which says Hallo zusammen, which is the same in German, if it's German. So this is something I can do if I run it with DE German. You can see that the result is Hallo zusammen. Sorry, it's I think you can read it, but I have no idea how to make this window bigger. And if I switch it to English and run it again, you can see now the result is hello world. So you could use this for your whole pipeline to make some language adjustment. And what you see is, what I do here is I actually exclude the the setting of the attribute value. So the element is physically removed. If I remove the p-wens and try to compile this, the compiler will say this is not allowed because you cannot bind the same attribute twice. You can take this even further, not using a variable like here, but using, sorry, make it bigger again, but you can, in select for the static option, you can use any static expression. So here I use psystem property, which is an XProc extension function with plocal. And if I run this on my computer, it should say Hallo zusammen because it's a German one. It says Hallo zusammen. If you run it on an English, on a system which is set to locale with EN, you will see Hello World. And if you run it on a French or a Dutch or something, whatever language selection you have, it will actually crash. It will not compile, because if you run it on a Dutch system, this won't be true and this won't be true. So these two will go away, and add attribute is called without an attribute value, and this is an error on compiling level. So you see the elements are actually excluded. Now the high thing someone asked for, and I made this bigger again, is what is about step overloading? Can I do step overloading? Yes, I can. Step overloading means I can write a step which have, in my case, two different signatures. If you look at this step, I have this step is simply called step, and it has a source port and a schema port, but the source port has, the schema port has a use when. So this element only appears if validate is true. And I have also here a validate with schematron step, and this validate with schematron step will only appear, or call to a validate schema step, will only appear if validate is true. And this gives me the opportunity to define two different steps, the extended version, which has 2 input ports, and the reduced version, which has just one input port, and this is done based on the value of $validate. I hope this gives you an idea of what you can do with use when. The only thing you have to remember is that you have to set the switches correctly. So when all the use whens are evaluated and the XProc processor actually sees the then pipeline, everything has to be in XProc syntax. I hope this answers the question. So we go back to Erik, I think.
Yes, that's right. There was a question by Martin Honnen. He is actually not, I don't see him in the attendees list, but I will try to answer it anyway, because he might listen to the recording later. He asks what the reasons were for our decisions around the options populate the default collection and global context item for the XSLT step. Now, that you might not even be aware that there were decisions made on that, but let me take you through them. The global context item in an XSLT3 style sheet means, well, what is your global context when you start running your XSLT style sheet? And the popular default collection, which is a Boolean in XProc, means that if it's true, then the default collection will, then the collection function will return all the documents that were on the source port of the XSLT step. If it's false, it will not populate the default collection at all. The global context item, if there's only one document on the source port, the global context will be this single document. If there are multiple documents on the source port, there will be no global context item. You have to set it explicitly if you need it. That's how we decided on. And it was controversial because some people actually found it very much an XSLT2 usage pattern. But we decided anyway to do it this way because we think, at least I think, and the majority of the editors voted for that, that most people will, at this moment at least, still write XSLT style sheets with using the global context and maybe using the default collection. They will do that in Oxygen, probably outside of an XProc context, or using Saxon or whatever on the command line. And if you do that, and you then it will just work. You have a global context item, you have a default collection, and things just work. And it would be I think it would be a bit of a disappointment if you plug this working XSLT style sheets into an XProc pipeline. It wouldn't work out of the box because suddenly the global context item wasn't there anymore, or the default collection. So we decided that since we expect the development of XSLT style sheets will be done outside of the XProc pipeline, that the XProc should behave like it was developed, like a development environment behaves. This is controversial because if you want to do streaming, you need to explicitly set the global context item to empty, to nothing, and you have to set the default collection to nothing, because otherwise your style sheet can't stream. But since we expect that most style sheets will be non-streaming, we think that's okay for the few people that do streaming. I hope this explains it for Martin or for other people. Back to Achim.
Yeah, thanks, Erik. Next question is from Sid. Can I get parallel execution of steps inside of for each? In particular, this use case he has in mind, I would like to validate roughly 500 files as quickly as possible, and I'm on a machine with 8 threads, so my XProc processor would be so kind to validate, say, 7 of them simultaneously, that would be great. Yes, we all have these machines with 3 or 4 or 5. So can I get parallel execution of steps? The general answer is yes, because the XProc specification says a processor is allowed to run the steps in a pipeline any way he likes, as long as he respects the connection between the steps. And it also means that 2 steps which are not connected can run in parallel. So there's nothing in XProc preventing parallel execution and parallel execution of a for each. This was the specification answer. Now the implementation answer. Is there a processor which does parallel execution of for each? I have no idea what Norm does on his upcoming processor, but my processor does not support parallel for each yet. I have a lot of parallel execution in my XProc processor, so every atomic step which is independent of each other can run in parallel. And I experimented with having for each parallel. Actually, my core machine is able to do this, but there are 2 backdraws with this. The first one is you cannot use side effects in for each. You cannot store something in for each because you do not know in which order the things are actually run. And this seems to be something which is important to a lot of people. In XProc this year, I announced that my processor would be able, one of the versions of my processor would be able to do parallel execution. And virtually the only question I got to this was, can I turn it off? Because obviously many people do something with side effects in for each. This is one thing. The second thing is, if I do for each in parallel, I have to make sure that every step you run is actually able to run in parallel from each other. And this is not guaranteed by all the tools I use. So can I get a processor? Yes, one day. Is there a processor which does this? No. I hope this answers Sid's question. But the point is obvious. We all have very powerful machines, and it would make sense to use more than one core. My processor does this as good as I can do it currently, but I will try to improve this. Ari.
Thank you, Achim. Thank you, Erik. I don't see any further questions in the Q&A. So I guess this is pretty much it. Unless there's a last-ditch question. No, nothing. Right. Well, thank you both. I found this really interesting, and I will certainly go back and check the answers, actually.
There's an open question now.
Well,
yes.
Okay, hang on. Sid, I will just allow you to talk.
Yeah, it's the easiest way.
Go, Sid.
Excellent. Am I audio?
Hi,
Yes.
Sid.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Thank you very much for the answer. I'm sorry to hear that it doesn't do that, but appreciate knowing from the horse's mouth. But then I'm curious, is there a different way I could structure the pipeline so that the validate step was a separate step instead of in a for each input file, and still manage to take advantage of a parallel processing? None
Yes.
come to mind, I have to say. But,
Sorry?
no such restructuring jumps to my mind, but you all are much better at this XProc stuff than I am. So.
Actually, what you could do is write 500 p-validate one after the other, each with a different file, and then start it. And my processor will then execute them in parallel.
Right, and of course I can write a simple XProc that does a directory and writes out another XPL file that has all 500 validate steps, couldn't I?
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Sid, what kind of machine do you have?
Just what operating system? Linux. Ubuntu.
It's Linux with an 8 core processor. Oh no, 4 core. No, it should be a 4 core processor with. Yeah. Okay. Yes, it will make it definitely. I will try to come up with something like for each, but currently I'm not really sure. And you might get some unexpected results if you use. Because I'm not really sure if you do validation. I do all the validation via customary steps. So I go to Ying for validation with RelaxNG and so on. And I'm not sure that those are thread safe. So be careful.
Okay.
I do not guarantee for any. It should work in principle, but I'm not sure these are thread safe. If they have a state they share between different threads, you will get in trouble.
So test the results first before relying on them.
Yes, please.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
There is also a question from Jorge. I will allow you to talk, Jorge. Floor is yours. Jorge, can you hear me?
Hello? Hello?
Yeah.
Hi, Jorge.
Yeah.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Thanks to everyone involved in this Markup UK. And it could be great if Achim could walk us through the X-query configuration of Morgana, because there are several options, and it could be great if you make us a fast introduction.
I think this. Okay. Am I allowed to share my screen? I am. So I think it will take too long to talk you through, but what I can do is to hint you to the description of this. If you go to my website, xmlproject.com, and go to documentation, you find a configuration explanation. And here's also how to connect the XSLT connector, how to connect the XQuery connector. Currently, I just support section 9.9 and section 10.0. You know, perhaps from my previous versions that also supported base X and another XQuery processor. Currently, it's only these two. The other ones are upcoming. Does this help? Otherwise,
Yes,
otherwise, if you run into trouble, just contact me.
I probably will.
Okay, I see you.
Right. Thanks for that, Jorge. Any further questions from anyone? Norm waves hello and apologizes for being late.
Hi, Norm.
Okay, so it looks like there might not be further questions. So thanks again, Achim and Erik, both of you, for this. And thanks everyone who joined our webinars, this one and the past ones. And again, please remember that they are all available on our YouTube channel. This one will too in a few short hours tops. And all that remains then is to, again, thank you all and have a good evening. And we all hope to see you again next year, hopefully in a physical conference.
May I say thank you
may.
to the, may I say thank you again to the organizers for making this all happen and to provide a way to keep the community together in these times. And I would like to come back to London again. So let's hope we can see each other next year.
Well put, Achim. From me the same.
Thanks both. So all take care out there and hopefully see you again next year. Bye.